Bonuses are canceled. That's what he said. Right there in the middle of our victory celebration. We were still passing around cold pizza and warm sodas from the break room. Everybody riding high because we just crushed our Q3 targets by 285%. Not 20%, not even 50%, 285%. You'd think we'd cured cancer with spreadsheets the way our operations floor was buzzing. My name's Wesley Harper. I'm 48, and I've been Director of Manufacturing Operations here for 14 years. Started as a junior production analyst right after my Navy stint, worked my way up the old-fashioned way, earning every promotion on the shop floor before moving to the office. My throat was raw from back-to-back calls closing that Fortune 100 automotive contract. My inbox was a battlefield of signed purchase orders and approved spec changes. Even Logan from IT was smiling, and Logan hasn't smiled since his divorce back in 2019. Then in strolls Preston Walsh, khakis pressed tighter than his budget projections, hair so perfectly styled it probably had its own maintenance contract. No hello, no congratulations. Just that smug lean he does when he's about to drop something monumentally stupid. He claps once, slow and deliberate. "Let's gather up," he chirps like he's calling a kindergarten class. "Need 5 minutes." The room went dead. I felt it in my gut, that sinking feeling you get right before someone says we're pivoting or there's been a restructuring. The same feeling I used to get on deployment when the radio crackled with bad news from command. He stood there with dead eyes and that fake humility they teach you in business school. You guys crushed it. Really, you absolutely crushed it. Beat every metric, exceeded every expectation. That's exactly why we're canceling Q3 bonuses. The room died completely. Sarah from marketing dropped her pizza slice. Calvin from finance looked like someone had just told him his calculator was broken. Preston did that thing where he tries to look philosophical, like he's delivering wisdom straight from some Harvard case study about disruptive leadership paradigms. "We're raising the bar," he continued, hands clasped behind his back like he was Napoleon reviewing troops. "This isn't about incentives anymore. This is about culture. Excellence. You already proved you can hit these numbers, so now we know what you're capable of. Time to try harder." People didn't move, didn't breathe. Sarah blinked like she'd forgotten how. Jordan from middle management opened and closed his mouth 3 times like a fish trying to form words that wouldn't get him fired. Nicole, my operations manager for 8 years, just stared at her hands. I didn't say a word, not yet. Just watched him standing there with that little shark smile like he'd just outsmarted a room full of people who'd been running manufacturing operations since before he learned to tie his designer shoes. His loafers probably cost more than our quarterly safety equipment budget, and he wore them like they gave him the authority to rewrite 14 years of proven systems. I sipped my coffee, burned my tongue, didn't care. The bitter taste matched my mood perfectly. Then I smiled, not wide, just once. The kind of smile you give when the wheels have been turning for weeks and someone just handed you the last piece you needed to spring the trap. Our target was $2.1 million in production efficiency gains for Q3. We hit $6.0 million. That's not just beating expectations. That's obliterating them and building a monument on the ruins. The automotive contract alone was worth $4.2 million in annual recurring revenue, and Preston knew it. Hell, he'd been copying my weekly progress reports and forwarding them to the board with his name in the signature line. I stood up slowly, walked over to where he was basking in his own perceived brilliance, and leaned in like I was going to offer some polite pushback about team morale and compensation equity. Instead, I just said, "Conference room, 5 minutes." He blinked, confused like someone had just asked him to explain how a torque wrench actually works. "Bring your laptop," I added, already walking away. Behind me, the room stayed silent except for the distinct sound of his ego inflating like a birthday balloon. I didn't need to yell, didn't need to get angry, not yet. Because this wasn't really about bonuses. This was about legacy, institutional knowledge, and the fact that Preston, poor, sweet, nepotism-soaked Preston Walsh, had no idea what was waiting for him behind that glass conference room door. You see, 10 years ago, when I signed my manufacturing operations agreement, there was a clause buried in the legal appendix, a clause that most people would skip over, thinking it was just standard boilerplate language. But I read everything. Navy taught me that. Always read the fine print, especially when your signature's going on it. The clause was simple. If quarterly production efficiency metrics exceeded 250% of forecast under my direct operational leadership, I'd be granted immediate strategic override privileges. At the time, nobody thought those numbers were possible. It was like putting a clause in there about what to do if we discovered oil in the parking lot. But we just hit 285%. And Preston Walsh was about to learn what happens when you mess with someone who's spent 14 years building something real, something that actually works, something that makes money instead of just burning it on consultant fees and motivational posters. 6 months earlier, Preston Walsh had arrived like a champagne cork at a funeral, loud, unnecessary, and bound to make a mess of everything nearby. The founder, Howard Walsh, had just announced he was taking a step back from day-to-day operations. Nothing too serious, he said over a Zoom call while noticeably using a portable oxygen tank in the background. Just some stress-related health issues, needed to focus on recovery for a few months. Then came the kicker that should have set off alarm bells for everyone in that meeting. I'm having my nephew Preston shadow senior leadership while I'm out. Just to observe, learn the ropes, understand how we operate. Observe, learn the ropes. Right, that was supposed to be the plan. But Preston walked through our lobby that Monday morning like he'd just bought the building fresh off his Harvard MBA, which he managed to name-drop roughly every 6 minutes, usually while misquoting Sun Tzu or referencing case studies about blockchain-enhanced farming equipment and cryptocurrency laundromats. I'm not making that up. Those were actual examples he used in meetings. His first words to me, delivered while I was reviewing production schedules at 7:30 a.m. So you're the one still using Excel instead of AI-driven predictive analytics? Cute. He said it with that condescending smile you see in LinkedIn posts about disrupting traditional industries. That week, my calendar exploded with meeting requests. Half of them had titles like Reimagining Manufacturing Pipeline Synergy and Innovation Jam Session, Industry 4.0 Transformation. I thought someone was pranking me until Preston sent a Slack message asking if I could align my operational narrative with the quarterly innovation vibe. I responded with a screenshot of our actual production dashboard, efficiency metrics, downtime tracking, quality control data, real numbers that actually meant something. He replied with a thumbs up emoji and a fire symbol. 3 days later, Nicole Reed, my operations manager and right hand for 8 years, was transitioned to a consulting role to focus on external opportunities. That was corporate speak for you're fired, but we're pretending it's your choice. 2 days after that, Bryce Miller from Data Analytics was reallocated for talent optimization initiatives. By the end of the first week, I was the only person left from the original manufacturing leadership team who didn't speak exclusively in pitch deck buzzwords or wear designer sneakers to production floor meetings. Preston started reshuffling departments like it was fantasy football draft day. He brought in his fraternity brother Hunter Kane as head of talent culture and workplace transformation, a guy whose primary qualification was hosting a podcast called Grindology, where he interviewed other people who also hosted podcasts about grinding. The episodes were exactly as useful as they sound. That was followed by a parade of consultants who looked like they'd never set foot in an actual manufacturing facility. Brand managers who brought ring lights to quarterly reviews. Strategy interns who said let's circle back on that instead of answering direct questions about production capacity. One guy named Mason Ford, who literally called himself a thought architect and spent $15,000 of our consulting budget explaining how our manufacturing processes needed more creative disruption energy. I tried to make it work. God help me, I really tried. I smiled through meetings where grown adults drew emojis on whiteboards. I rewrote production reports using language that wouldn't give me a migraine. I sat through Preston's mindshare briefings even when they involved discussing how we could gamify quality control metrics and leverage social media influencers to improve employee engagement on the factory floor. I had one job during all this chaos: keep the production lines running, protect the systems we'd spent over a decade building and refining, and make sure our delivery schedules didn't collapse under the weight of all this innovation theater. Do what guys like me have always done in corporate America: hold the line while the MBAs play dress-up CEO. Then came the big opportunity, that Fortune 100 automotive contract. Ford Motor Company needed a precision parts supplier for their electric vehicle production line, and this was exactly the kind of high-volume, high-precision work we'd been positioning ourselves for over the past 5 years. I'd worked on the strategy proposal for 2 months straight. Nights, weekends, hell. I outlined half of it on a flight to Detroit using cocktail napkins because my laptop died and the airline's Wi-Fi was about as reliable as Preston's understanding of actual manufacturing. The contract requirements were complex: multi-tier quality certifications, just-in-time delivery schedules, integration with their supply chain management systems. It required real industry knowledge, actual experience with automotive manufacturing standards, and the kind of operational expertise you don't get from case studies. I briefed Preston thoroughly, prepared him with a comprehensive overview document, walked him through 3 practice presentations, even created simplified talking points for the technical questions. He nodded along and asked if we could make the PowerPoint slides more visually dynamic and whether our company logo could be bigger. He walked into that Ford pitch meeting like he was auditioning for Shark Tank, gesturing wildly and throwing around phrases like agility-first manufacturing verticals and cross-pollinated production deliverables. I physically cringed watching him explain our synergistic approach to automotive component optimization, while the Ford engineers exchanged glances that clearly said, "What is this guy talking about?" Somehow, by sheer force of market timing and the fact that my actual operational data spoke louder than his corporate word salad, we landed the contract. Our production capabilities were exactly what they needed, our quality metrics were solid, and our delivery track record was spotless. The next morning, I opened my email to find a company-wide announcement from Preston with the subject line, Q3 Victory Lap. First sentence: proud to share the success of my strategic automotive sector pivot and innovative client acquisition methodology. My name wasn't mentioned once in that email, not once. 14 years of building relationships, developing expertise, and delivering results, and I'd been erased from my own success story by a 28-year-old who couldn't tell the difference between a torque specification and a talking point. I stared at that email for a long time, long enough for my coffee to get cold, long enough for the production floor shift change to happen outside my office window, long enough for my hands to stop shaking from pure frustration. But I didn't reply, didn't fire back with a correction, didn't even leak it to the internal Slack channels like part of me wanted to. Because that clause was still sitting in my personnel file, buried in a folder I hadn't opened in years. A clause that didn't care about Harvard degrees or nepotism or who had the best hair gel budget. I printed out that email, folded it neatly, and put it in my desk drawer right next to the original hiring agreement. Then I went back to work, running the numbers, checking the production schedules, making sure we'd hit every single metric we'd promised Ford. Because when you're building a trap, patience isn't just a virtue, it's the foundation. It was late Thursday night, the kind of late where the janitor's music becomes your only company and even the coffee maker sounds lonely. I was the last one in the building again, my screen glowing with quarterly numbers fresh off Calvin's final calculations. The production efficiency line blinked back at me like it knew something. 285% over target. We hadn't just hit our goals, we'd obliterated them, buried them in the parking lot, and built a monument on top. Every projection, every stretch target, every optimistic estimate from marketing, completely destroyed. The Ford contract wasn't just signed, it was expanding. They wanted us to handle components for 3 additional vehicle lines, with preliminary discussions about a $12 million annual partnership. My hands hovered over the keyboard. Not from fatigue, but from memory. 10 years ago, I'd signed my manufacturing operations agreement in this same office. Back when Howard still walked the production floor every morning, still knew the names of our machine operators, still cared about building things that lasted instead of just quarterly stock price bumps. That contract was drafted during a different era. Before the consultants, before the buzzword evangelists, before the company decided that culture could be purchased with kombucha on tap and meditation pods. I opened my personal files buried under years of NDAs and performance reviews, found it, the original hiring agreement, page 14, subsection C, footnote 2. I'd read it carefully back then because the Navy taught me to read every word of anything I was signing. Most people skip the appendices, think they're just standard legal boilerplate. But this wasn't boilerplate. If quarterly production efficiency metrics for manufacturing operations exceed 250% of forecast under the direct operational leadership of Wesley Harper, he shall be granted immediate and temporary strategic override privileges, including but not limited to voting presence in executive-level decisions pending board ratification. Signed by Howard Walsh. Dated, witnessed, filed with HR under reference number MFG 2014 447. Still valid, still enforceable. I leaned back in my chair and stared at those words. The clause had been written back when hitting 250% seemed about as likely as discovering oil under the employee parking lot. It was supposed to be a motivational carrot, something generous sounding with zero risk. Legal decoration for a manufacturing director they never expected to actually deliver those kinds of numbers. But we'd just hit 285%. And Preston Walsh was about to learn what happens when you underestimate someone who's spent 14 years turning theoretical targets into actual results. I printed the page on premium paper. Something about the weight made it feel more ceremonial. Highlighted the clause in thick yellow marker, then copied it again just to be thorough. Placed it in a folder with our Q3 performance report clipped behind it, every number verified and cross-checked. The next morning I made 3 phone calls. First to Jessica Collins in legal, one of the few people in that department who'd survived Preston's organizational optimization. Her voice dropped to a whisper when I read the clause aloud. "That's still active?" she asked, sounding like someone who'd just realized they'd been sitting on a live grenade. "Yep, and our efficiency metrics hit 285.3%. Long pause, then a low whistle. "Wesley, you're going to need a much bigger office." Second call went to our former compliance director, semi-retired and fishing somewhere in Montana. He remembered drafting the clause, laughed for a solid 30 seconds before saying, "Son, I hope you kept all the receipts for this one." Third call, I didn't make one. I sat with it, let the silence sink in. This wasn't about rushing. This was about timing. Move too fast and it looks personal, vindictive. But let Preston climb just a little higher. Let him plan one more condescending all-hands meeting, and the fall would have real impact. That folder stayed on my desk like a loaded weapon for exactly 3 days. Then came Monday morning's bonus announcement, and Preston handed me the perfect moment on a silver platter. After his performance should be baseline speech, I'd asked him to meet me in the conference room. Now we were face to face across that polished table, and Preston was already starting to fidget. He'd brought his laptop but hadn't opened it yet, probably expecting some kind of employee relations conversation about team morale. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair with that practiced casual confidence, "I get that people are disappointed about the bonus situation, but we need to focus on sustainable motivation models rather than—" "Preston," I interrupted quietly, "can you pull up the org chart for manufacturing operations?" He blinked, confused by the change in direction. "I mean, sure, but I don't see how that's relevant to humor me." He clicked around for a minute, clearly not sure where to find it. Finally got a PowerPoint slide up showing the department structure with his name at the top and mine somewhere in the middle tier. "Okay, here's the current leadership framework. As you can see, we've optimized the hierarchy for—" "Now pull up our Q3 performance metrics." More clicking. He found Calvin's summary report, the one showing our 285% efficiency gain. "Right, and these are obviously great numbers, which is exactly why we're raising expectations instead of just throwing money at—" "Preston." I slid the folder across the table. "Open it." He looked at the folder like it might contain his performance review, which in a way, it did. Flipped it open to the highlighted contract page, started reading, his confident expression slowly melting like ice cream in July. "I don't understand what I'm looking at here," he said, but his voice had lost that cocky edge. "That's my original hiring agreement, subsection C, footnote 2. The highlighted part gives me strategic override authority when production efficiency exceeds 250% of forecast. We hit 285%. Howard's signature is right there at the bottom." Preston stared at the page like he was trying to read hieroglyphics. "But this is just some old contract language. Legal boilerplate. Nobody actually enforces. It's not boilerplate. It's a performance trigger clause, and it just got activated." I pulled out my phone. I've already confirmed its validity with legal. Jessica's preparing the formal documentation as we speak. His face had gone from confused to pale to something approaching panic. "Look, Wesley, I think there might be some misunderstanding here about chain of command and organizational structure. Modern management doesn't really operate on these kinds of legacy. Modern management," I said, closing the folder, "should probably read contracts before canceling bonuses for record-breaking performance." That's when I saw it. The exact moment when Preston realized he wasn't the smartest person in the room. Maybe never had been. His carefully constructed authority was built on quicksand, and the tide was coming in fast. I stood up and walked to the conference room door. Howard's joining us via video in 10 minutes. The department heads will be here too. I suggest you use that time to think about whether you want to handle this transition professionally. I left him sitting there with the folder, probably calculating how fast he could call Uncle Howard for backup. But Howard Walsh didn't get where he was by backing down from his own signature. And Preston was about to learn that when you're standing on someone else's foundation, they always hold the blueprints. 10 minutes later, the conference room filled with the quiet tension of a courtroom before verdict. Department heads trickled in, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Sarah from marketing sat down carefully, eyes darting between Preston and me. Calvin clutched his laptop like a shield. Logan from IT actually showed up early, which told me word was already spreading through the building. On the main screen, Howard Walsh's face appeared in that familiar corner tile. Still thin from his health issues, still using the oxygen tank, but his eyes were sharp as ever. The kind of sharp that built this company from 12 employees in a rented warehouse to 500 people across 3 facilities. Preston straightened in his chair, probably expecting Uncle Howard to straighten this whole mess out with a few words about family loyalty and chain of command. Maybe remind everyone who was really in charge here. "Morning, everyone," Howard said, his voice carrying that gravelly authority that came from 30 years of making decisions that actually mattered. His eyes swept the room, pausing on Preston before settling on me. "Wesley, I understand you have something important to discuss. I didn't waste time with pleasantries." Clicked the remote and brought up our Q3 performance slide. 285% efficiency improvement over forecast, $6 million in verified savings, Ford contract signed and expanding to 3 additional product lines. Howard nodded slowly. He'd seen these numbers already, but this wasn't about the numbers. This was about what came next. Additionally, I continued, I'd like to reference subsection C, footnote 2 of my 2014 manufacturing operations agreement. I clicked to the next slide. The scanned contract page, highlighted clause clearly visible. Performance threshold met. Strategic override authority now active. The room went dead silent. Preston's face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching terror as he realized this wasn't going to be the family intervention he'd expected. Howard stared at the screen for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of someone who'd just watched his own signature come back to haunt his family. I remember that clause. I insisted on it myself. Preston finally found his voice. "Uncle Howard, this is just some outdated contract language. We can't seriously be considering—" "Son," Howard interrupted, and the single word carried 30 years of disappointment. "Stop talking." The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Howard's eyes moved from the contract to Preston, then back to me. "Wesley, what are you requesting?" "Full operational authority for Q4, personnel restoration, budget oversight, strategic planning. No interference, no committee reviews." I slid a folder across the table toward the camera. "Jessica in legal has the formal documentation ready for your signature." Preston tried one more time. This is obviously some kind of power grab using legal technicalities. Modern corporations don't operate on these kinds of legacy. "Preston." Howard's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You're done. Pack your office. Security will escort you out in 20 minutes. The words hung in the air like smoke. Preston opened his mouth, closed it, opened it, again. For once in his life, he had nothing to say. No buzzwords, no case studies, no thought leadership frameworks. Just the reality that nepotism only works when the family member with actual power is on your side. He stood up slowly, gathered his designer notebook, an imported water bottle, and walked out. No dramatic exit, no threats, just the quiet shuffle of someone who'd finally realized he was never actually qualified for the job in the first place. Howard turned his attention back to me. "The board's prepared to offer you interim executive authority, reporting directly to—" "No," I said gently. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't need a title to do the job. I just need the authority to fix what got broken." He smiled for the first time in months. Approved. That afternoon, I sent 2 text messages. First to Nicole Reed, "Come back, your desk is waiting." Second to Bryce Miller, "Operations needs its data guy. Are you interested?" Both responded within 10 minutes. Nicole's reply was just a thumbs-up emoji. Bryce wrote back, On my way. They walked through the lobby the next morning like soldiers returning from exile. No fanfare, no welcome back party, just rolled up sleeves and the quiet satisfaction of competent people getting back to real work. Hunter Kane, Preston's podcast hosting head of culture, quietly submitted his resignation that Friday. Mason Ford, the thought architect, simply stopped showing up. His $15,000 consulting contract was terminated for non-performance, and our legal team was surprisingly efficient about getting our money back. 3 weeks later, Howard's name lit up my phone screen at 6:15 a.m. Wesley, I need you to look at something. An hour later, I was back in the conference room with a merger proposal from Parker Stevens, CEO of Atlantic Manufacturing Solutions. East Coast company, bigger than us in automation technology, smaller in production capacity. Perfect synergy if handled right. Parker joined via video, all business and no nonsense. We've been watching your Q3 performance. Impressive doesn't begin to cover it. We'd like to discuss integration, but we have one non-negotiable requirement, which is full operational oversight from Wesley's team. No outside management, no transition committees, no consultants. Just the people who actually delivered those results. Howard looked at me through the screen. Your call, Wesley. I thought about the past 6 months. Preston's chaos, the consultant parade, watching good people get pushed out for buzzword compliance. Then I thought about the production floor humming at 98% efficiency, the Ford contract expanding, and Nicole training new analysts who actually understood what operational excellence meant. Let's do it, I said. The paperwork was signed within 2 weeks. No drama, no restructuring announcements, just 2 companies that knew how to build things combining their strengths. 6 months later, I got a LinkedIn notification. Preston Walsh had started his own disruptive consulting firm called Innovation Catalyst Solutions. His company page had 23 followers and 1 case study about leveraging synergistic paradigm shifts. I smiled, closed the laptop, and walked out to the production floor. The machines hummed steady at 97% efficiency. Our Q4 numbers were tracking 22% ahead of the combined projections. Nicole was training 3 new operations analysts who actually knew the difference between productivity and performance theater. The Ford partnership had expanded into a 5-year strategic alliance worth $18 million annually. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic. It's not about explosions or public humiliation or viral LinkedIn posts. Sometimes the best revenge is just being right, being competent, and watching incompetence burn itself out while you quietly build something that actually works. Preston learned to speak in buzzwords, but I learned to speak in results, and in the end, results always win. They just take a little longer to get there. The clause was never removed from my contract. Howard insisted on keeping it. Insurance policy, he called it, in case anyone else gets confused about who actually runs the operations around here. Fair enough, some foundations are worth protecting.